Hi, I'm Dr. Jamison Spencer with Cadwell Therapeutics. Today I'm going to talk about use of various bite gauges for fitting of the silent sleep. Here I've set up several different bite gauges. These are the original silent sleep bite gauges. These are the new silent sleep bite gauges. Here we have the George gauge, which is used by many dentists for taking bite registrations for custom oral appliances. And here we have the Andre gauge, which is a unique bite registration appliance also used for custom appliances. I'm going to show how to use all of these for fitting of the silent sleep. The original silent sleep bite gauges were a little wider, had a shallow groove here. The depth from one groove to the other is roughly 7 millimeters, so 7 millimeters of vertical interincisally. We changed from the old gauge to a new gauge here and made a few modifications. You'll notice it is much thinner, the new gauge, so it is easier to fit over the central incisors if someone has some overlapping or their lower incisors are a little crooked, whereas this one was more difficult to fit on those patients. There may still be some application of the old gauges. For example, if you had someone with a relatively thick teeth or their cingulum was rather thick, then the depth of this groove may not allow their tooth to go all the way down into it. And we can modify that though, and I'll show that on another video, how to modify these gauges either to reduce the vertical or to allow the incisors to come down farther. The new gauge is designed with deeper grooves to make it very obvious to the patient where their teeth need to be. And then we have this little tapering coming down where when this is placed in the mouth, the silent sleep will fit on the anterior aspect of the gauge there, and the lingual bar will hit there, whereas the lower incisors will be right under here. So the lower incisors will stop here, and that will keep the lingual bar from touching the lingual surface of the lower incisors. So that will ensure that we don't have any undesirable forces against those teeth. So that's why that's designed in that way. Now with the silent sleep gauges, we have 0 or end-to-end, +2, +4, and +6 in both of these sets. If you have a patient that their jaw is not able to come all the way end to end, you can take either of these sets and flip him over, and +2 now becomes -2. Of course, we'd lose that taper advantage of the new gauge, but still you can do that, or you could do that with the old gauge by flipping that over. That now becomes -2, so that would allow their jaw to not have to come all the way end to end. So with the 4 gauges, you actually have 7 different positions. And I'll show how to use those in the patient's mouth in just a second. With the George gauge, we have the typical George gauge here. The George gauge comes with 5 millimeter vertical and 2 millimeter vertical, and you may choose one or the other vertical just depending on what's going on with that patient. For example, someone with a very deep overbite, you may use the lower vertical so that they're not so far open, so wide open in the posterior. But let's kind of focus on the 5 millimeter here. Again, you typically, to do a bite registration, you would use the fork like this. You would put your bite registration material on the fork, put that between the patient's teeth, and register that bite. For use with the silent sleep, we're going to take this fork and bend these off, like so. And you can prepare this in advance and actually smooth that off a little bit if you want to. It's not too pokey otherwise, but you can smooth that off and then use this for fitting the silent sleep. So now that seems a little bit more like our silent sleep gauge. And we have the advantage of being able to adjust that in as small of increments as we want, anterior, posterior. And we have the 2 different verticals set in, so 2 millimeter and 5 millimeter. So between a George gauge and our silent sleep gauges, we have 2 millimeter vertical, 5 millimeter vertical, 7 millimeter vertical. So a lot of variability there that we can use to our advantage. Now, once you've used this to fit the silent sleep, you could simply cold sterilize this portion and do this over and over again. You don't need to waste a fork every time you do this. This would be your silent sleep fitting George gauge device just like that. And of course, you can use that same body of the George gauge to use the George gauge in the normal manner to make bite registrations for custom appliances. The Andre gauge is going to be a similar technique. The Andre gauge has the advantages of being able to adjust anterior, posterior, as well as vertical, and as well as midline. So there are 3 different abilities to move with the gauge, and so that makes it really nice, and it's nice to be able to easily move the vertical up and down. So from basically 2 to 3 millimeters there up to about 9 millimeters. So this has a lot of adjustability with the vertical dimension as well as the AP position. Now, if you're using this for a bite registration, just like the George gauge, you would find the position that you wanted to have it in, put your blue moose or whatever onto the fork, have them bite down into that position, and grab that bite. For use with the silent sleep, we would have one of our Andra gauges that is specifically for the silent sleep, because once I do what I'm about to do here, we can't use it for a bite registration technique anymore. So I break that off. And now this Andra gauge can only be used for fitting of the silent sleep. So we can now use this just like we can the other gauges to fit the silent sleep. And I'll show how to do that here in just a second. Okay, so now I'm going to cut from here, and we will use each of these with the patient to show how to do that. Okay, so now we're going to do the different gauges, or use the different gauges, and show just the different utility of them. So I've used taken a +2 for both of the silent sleep gauges. And again, typically how we use the silent sleep gauge, or any gauge that we're going to use in fitting the silent sleep, is I like the patient to make a snoring noise in the back of their throat. And then we try that with the gauge in place to find the position that makes it harder for them to make that noise. I've just determined that we're going to use +2 millimeters basically in all of these different gauges, and show you how that would work, and you get the idea otherwise. So go ahead and make that snoring noise in the back of your throat. Okay, good. And then close down, and you got to come forward. So the patient will have to bring their jaw forward a little bit to find that. I want to make sure that the midline's not sliding over. So right there, that looks good. Make that noise again. Okay, so more difficult for her to make that snoring noise there. Again, especially with the original silent sleep gauge, real tendency for it to dip down like this, which would take the jaw backwards. Also easier for the teeth to slide out of it. Okay, so with using this one, we want to make sure we are on the gauge correctly, and you may want to check every once in a while to make sure the teeth are still in it, and the patient hasn't, go ahead and just slide back a little bit, Jenny, hasn't slid back, which would obviously change the jaw position dramatically. So go ahead and open. With the new silent sleep gauge, we have that tapering, we have the deeper grooves. The taper part is to go lingual to the lower incisors. So open, and you can do this either way. You can either put it on the bottom first and close and have them bite into that, open. If she was to have her jaw farther back, close. You're just going to hit on that big broad spot there and then slide forward until it falls in. So that's the easiest way to do it. Also with the silent sleep, go ahead and open. With the silent sleep in place, again, the advantage of this taper is that we are going to have the tray on like so, and we can position the lingual to make sure that the lingual bar does not touch the lower teeth. We can kind of visually see that, close down, and she bites right into it, and then we're able to take the fork out and let it fit. And we could do that same technique with any of these here. So go ahead and open. Okay, so that's the new silent sleep gauge. Very quick, very easy to use. Again, we can flip that over if the patient's jaw is not able to come quite as far forward. Using the George gauge, and we would just set that to a +2 position. I just broke these off a second ago, and so the same thing, open and close. Okay, and she would close into that, go ahead and open. You can also open this up a little bit if you need more room for the incisors to go all the way down for people that have slightly thicker teeth. The nice thing again with the George gauge is you can simply change it very quickly. So if we decided, here, let's kind of go ahead and go through that. So let's start at 0. Okay, and make the snoring noise. And close. Make that same noise. Okay, more difficult, open, and then I can just quickly go to +2, or I could go to +1, I could go to +3, doesn't matter, and close, and make that noise again. Okay, so whatever I decide on here, I can then notate in the chart that the silent sleep was fit using the George gauge at a +3, at a +4, at a +2, at a +1, whatever it is. We can note that in the chart, and then we know where we're going from there. That's also handy because if we ultimately then find a position with the silent sleep that we want to use for a custom appliance, we could just simply say, well, we fit the silent sleep in a +2 position, now let's take our bite registration in a +2 position, and would be basically dead on the same spot. With the Andre gauge, same thing. So if I set this at a +2 position, and open and close. One of the nice things about the Andre gauge is that the grooves are nice and wide. It's very easy for the patient to get their teeth into them. And open. And then the same thing, we can easily adjust the position on this. We can easily adjust the vertical. And that's one unique thing about the Andre gauge that's very simple for us to do, is we could make that same snoring noise. Let's go ahead and go through that. So I'll take this at about the +2 position there. And this is closed down, so it's about 2 millimeters of vertical right there. Go ahead and close. Good. Make that noise. Okay. And then, actually, you don't even need to open that. I just kind of gently open. I'm going to open her up just a little bit and go ahead and make that same noise. Right there. Make that same snoring noise. And you notice that was actually more difficult to open for me. More difficult for her to make that noise by opening her vertical, not bringing her any farther forward. So that's an advantage here, is that is now open about 5 millimeters of vertical, and we were able to do that very quickly, and we could go even greater vertical than that. With the Andre gauge, the same thing. We would want to write down the different positions that we had here, the AP position and the vertical position, and ultimately if we decide to make a custom appliance in that same position, we'd be able to go back in our notes and say, with an Andre gauge at 5 millimeters of vertical and 2 millimeters of anterior protrusion, that's where we want to take our bite registration for the custom appliance. So that's how to use the various bite gauges. Again, we can use the old silent sleep gauges, the new silent sleep gauges. You can use the George gauge if you're comfortable. You can use the Andre gauge. All of these are going to have the same effect of bringing the jaw into a position. With these minor modifications, it is easy for us to have the silent sleep tray in place. This is one of the biggest advantages of the silent sleep, is we're able to have it in place with the material in place and close and use any bite gauge that's out there. There are even some other ones that I haven't gone over in this video that exist that you could also use. The airway metric system, for example, is an excellent system for finding the right bite recording or the bite registration, and can also be used to fit the silent sleep. So you may have a bite registration system in your office already that you're using, that you're comfortable with, and you can figure out now from watching this video how to modify what you're already using so that you could fit the silent sleep with it. Thank you.